Now, Japan has joined the long list of countries to raise objections to a new Chinese map. Tokyo has lodged a strong protest to China through diplomatic channels over the new map released by Beijing last month. Earlier, India, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam and Taiwan lodged protests against China over its new standard map for making false territorial claims. The development comes as leaders of countries like Japan, US, India and China met ASEAN leaders in Indonesia. Indonesia hosted the 18th East Asia Summit in Jakarta. The summit brings together the 10 ASEAN member states and 8 dialogue partners. These include Australia, China, India, Japan, the Republic of Korea, New Zealand, Russia and the United States. The summit was once again dominated by the issue of Beijing's growing aggression in the South China Sea, as well as regional security issues that also came up during the summit, which was also attended by the US Vice President Kamala Harris and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Now, Prime Minister Modi is currently on his way back from Jakarta. He took part in the 18th East Asia Summit as well as the 20th India-ASEAN Summit. Prime Minister Modi addressed the ASEAN meeting, saying that India and ASEAN nations both have historical and geographical links. He expressed confidence in the India-ASEAN relations, saying that new measures will be taken to strengthen future ties.
आसियान भारत की एक्ट ईस्ट पॉलिसी का केंद्रीय स्तंभ है। भारत आसियान सेंट्रलिटी और इंडो पैसिफिक पर आसियान के आउटलुक का पूर्ण समर्थन करता है।
Chinese President Xi Jinping skipped the key summits in Indonesia. Chinese Premier Li Qiang represented Beijing instead. Now, for more on this, we are being joined by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, live from New Delhi. Hello to you, Siddhant. Now, where do India-ASEAN relations stand in light of the upcoming G20 summit? What possible measures to further strengthen ties can we expect post the Indian Prime Minister's visit to Jakarta?
Well, this was a significant visit in every sense possible. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is right now on his way back from Jakarta and he will be arriving to Delhi in almost few hours. But essentially the fact that the Indian Prime Minister was in Jakarta for ASEAN meetings just one day prior to the beginning of the G20 summit shows the emphasis the Indian leadership provides when it comes to engagement with the ASEAN grouping. Now, when it comes to the ASEAN grouping, there was an upgrade in the relationship to comprehensive one last year, and this year we saw how the Indian Prime Minister emphasized on ASEAN centrality. He talked about how ASEAN is the epicenter of growth and also talked about essentially how both sides can work together at a time of increased geopolitical changes. He was present both at the India-ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit. Now, we will see more focus by both sides in terms of engagement at a time when, of course, China has been very aggressive. We know that the ongoing ASEAN summits come at a time when China came up with its new map claiming territories of countries from ASEAN to India to Russia to Japan and others, and drew a strong response from the region. And there is increased awareness of China being a country with aggressive posture in the region.
And the 18-nation meeting brings Washington and Beijing into contact a day after Premier Li Qiang warned major powers must manage their differences to avoid a new Cold War. Will this meet be a fiery affair due to the differences between the major powers?
Well, where there are China Russia and United States as member of any meeting, there are expected to be strong positions by all the three sides. Now, East Asia Summit have all the three countries as part of it, and there were, of course, concerns raised by the American side, and of course the Chinese side coming up with their own idea as to how there is a new Cold War in the world. But essentially, when it comes to bridging the gap, both sides, and in fact all sides, have to work towards it. And we know that when it comes to India, how India will be dealing with this challenge as it gets ready for the G20 summit is something that will be the big focus. The big focus remains both the joint statements here in Delhi after the G20 summit and also the East Asia summit. Will it come up with a joint statement is another big factor.
Right, and Siddhant, even though the Indian Prime Minister has returned to India to oversee the preparations for the G20 summit, ASEAN members are holding bilateral meetings with India, Australia and the UN on Thursday. Can you tell us more about what's lined up there?
Well, you know, if you look at the ASEAN group's proceedings, this was, in fact, this last of the summits are still underway, was a meeting which saw not only the ASEAN grouping holding a summit, but they holding as a group summit meetings with countries like India. The Indian Prime Minister participated in one of those summit meetings, the India-ASEAN summit meeting, and pointed out towards ASEAN centrality, while host Indonesian President talked about how, of course, India and ASEAN can work and they have a lot of potential that needs to be harnessed. But essentially, when it comes to meeting with the countries outside of the region, the emphasis is that how ASEAN as a grouping can engage with them, whether it's India, Australia, South Korea and Japan, countries with which it has summit level meetings, but also to emphasized on the ASEAN centrality in the Indo-Pacific and also ASEAN unity at a time of great geopolitical flux and an increasingly aggressive China.
Absolutely, Siddhant. Thank you very much for bringing us all the latest.